Hello and welcome to the How Not to Screw Up Your Kids podcast, the bucket emptying episodes. I'm your host, Dr. Mary Han, psychologist and parenting expert. So, pour yourself a cuppa, find a comfy seat, and enjoy the conversation. Today's bucket emptying episode, I'm talking specifically about the one thing that I believe can have the biggest impact to us as parents in terms of emptying our bucket, and that's around boundaries. So what do we mean by boundaries themselves? I like to sort of think of them as tracks, pathways that guide the sort of tasks and things that our children do. So if we imagine that it's a specific lane and our children travel along that lane, depending on what the task might be. So if we think about when our children are younger, when they're really young, the tracks and the pathways tend to be pretty narrow. And we have it that way because it's the best way to keep our children safe. So we have a very narrow pathway with a 2-year-old around bedtime. We have a very narrow pathway with a 2-year-old around foods that they eat. Not because we're being controlling, but because actually that's a really important way of helping nurture their development and their growth. And what then happens is as our children get older, we ought to then start considering widening some of those tracks and pathways so that we can create an element of independence, we can create an element of problem solving, and we can create an element of them learning consequences. Now, I mean consequences in this context as much more about if I don't take my coat when we're going out and it rains, I get wet. It's those sorts of consequences which help build their knowledge and help them become much more independent. Now, contrary to what you might believe, boundaries are really healthy and important for children and also ourselves because it gives them a framework that they can kind of operate within. Now, as we know, our children are always going to be testing those boundaries. They'll test them when they're younger, they'll test them when they're older. And what we tend to typically find as our children sort of enter those teen and tween years is they tend to push on the edges of those lanes and those boundaries quite often. And so it's really crucial that we're really clear what those boundaries are, why we've put them in place, and how we're going to ensure that they remain. And so I just want you to consider, and the reason why this episode is coming out at this particular period of time is in the UK, we are entering into school holidays, so school half terms. And so that's often a time that we see those boundaries being pushed a little bit more. But obviously, it'll be helpful at any time. But I know that that's often where we tend to see these boundaries being pushed. So there are some questions that I just want you to consider as we kind of look at how we might put some boundaries in or how we might flex some of those boundaries at any point, school holidays or not. So boundaries are in place to help give our children and our teens some form of structure from which to operate in. And it also gives them an element of bandwidth on which to try things sometimes and also sometimes fail. So that's kind of a crucial thing. And it's almost like their security blanket, their safety net. Now, they're not going to thank you for it often. They'll often, declare that it's so unfair and everyone else is allowed to do X, Y, and Z, and you're so strict and you're so mean. But actually, those boundaries can be a really great sort of, as I say, security blanket, comforter for our children. And also for us, it makes a very clear statement on what is acceptable and unacceptable within our family, within the culture that we create within our family and the foundations that we lay for our children's building, which is under construction. And the other crucial part about boundaries is when we set clear boundaries, and we're not being dictatorial, we're not sort of being, dogmatic in everything, but when we set very clear boundaries, which we enforce consistently and compassionately, what we also do is model respect for ourselves, respect for the household. And what then happens is because we're modeling that gives our children the framework and the capabilities to then set boundaries for themselves, for their taking care of themselves, for their friendships, what they'll tolerate and what they won't tolerate. So it's a really crucial part of that whole thing. So let's just talk a little bit more about how we might put some of these boundaries in place and when we might consider flexing them. Now, my view is very much when we're considering safety and the kind of crucial aspects of child nurturing and development, their well-being, that the lanes need to be, and we ought to consider them to be more narrow. So what might some of these things be? Well, for me, it'll be things like sleep. Sleep should be quite a narrow lane, and that's not just a narrow lane in terms of the time they go to sleep, but their sleep and unwinding routine. So it's all of that build up to sleep, and also what is in their bedroom that might facilitate and ensure that they really get a good night's sleep. So sleep for me is quite a narrow lane. Nutrition, in terms of making sure that they have a broad breadth of foods that they eat rather than the sort of, going for very particular foods, I think couldn't be that bit wider, because we want to flex an element of choice. We want to make sure that our children make good choices in terms of their food moving forward. But we also, in lots of ways, want to give them some element of choice. So that isn't, would you like cake or would you like chocolate? It's much more around, okay, well, these are the essentials to a good meal, but you get to choose maybe 2 of the 3 vegetables that we're going to serve, for example. And so we know it's all about a little bit of everything, a little bit of moderation. So for me, food might be a slightly broader lane that they can operate within. Some of the sort of wider lanes may well be around how they spend their time. So there may be some very clear sort of pathways in terms of bedtime being a particular time and tasks being done, whether that's homework, whether that's tidying up their bedrooms, whether that is making good after they have used facilities within our home that we all have to contribute towards. But what they do with their time may well then be a much wider lane within some very specific parameters. And affording our children that opportunity of the wider lanes helps them, trial and error, make choices, make decisions for themselves that they then see natural consequences to. So, for example, they may have an expanse of time, whether that's a weekend, whether that's a school holiday, where they know that there's a top and tail task. So the tail task may well be that bedtime, and at some point during that day, there's a task around tidying up their bedroom or getting some specific work completed. If we make that lane quite broad, what we're doing is we're allowing them that chance to sort of try things out and to learn through themselves, not necessarily us, through their own problem solving and trial and error, that actually when they do all of the things that they love doing first of all during the day, whether that's devices, watching films, streaming, going to meet friends, is what they then find is suddenly a natural consequence of doing the good stuff first is the tasks, the chores, the homework, whatever it might be, are then bottlenecked at the end of the day and may either not get done at all or may be done in a rush. And that's a great and really powerful learning tool for them, because what they do is they learn, actually, when I do the good stuff first, it's really not pleasant, everything being kind of shoehorned in at the end of the day when I might want to decompress and relax, or when I might have planned to do something else. So that's the beauty of us making those decisions about, can I broaden that lane and that pathway? Can I give them a little bit more autonomy? Give them that opportunity for them to make the decisions so that they can learn firsthand. Because really that's the most powerful way for our children to learn. So it's looking at what opportunities do we have to widen certain lanes whilst also keeping other lanes really narrow for their well-being, and to ensure that the real kind of fundamentals then play out the way that we want them to. So I hope that that's really helpful for you, whether you're listening to this over a weekend and you're going to try widening those lanes, or you're listening to this specifically with a school holiday in mind. As ever, if you have enjoyed this episode or you enjoy listening to the podcast generally, I would be eternally grateful if you could follow, rate and review this podcast. Share it with friends so that others can find us and we can spread the love. So until next time.